L'chol zman va'et, l'chol chefetz tachat hashamayim. Kohelet teaches us that there's a season for everything. A time for everything under the heaven. There's a time for giving birth and a time for dying. A time for planting and a time for uprooting the plant. A time for slaying and a time for healing. There's a time for loving and a time for hating. There's a time for war and there's a time for peace. What life contains and demands of us is very often, as we all know, unfair. It demands of us to function in the midst of environments in which it doesn't seem fair that we should function. It doesn't give you time out. And throughout the cycle of our lives, there's a time in which different moments and different experiences challenge us. In our existence in Israel, this is a time for killing. This is a time for war. The question is, when will there be a time for healing? When will there be a time for peace? In the midst of killing and war, it's very often hard to imagine that there could be another time. It's hard to stretch your heart. It's hard to stretch yourself emotionally. It's hard to even imagine. How could I even think about that right now? Don't talk about this now. There is a time for everything under the heaven, but what is the time? And when does that time come? When is it too early? And when is it too late? None of us really know. And in most of us in our own lives, we're on our own cycle of time. And we move at our own pace. And when we hear somebody speaking on their cycle, it sometimes feels disjointed. Sometimes it feels wrong. Sometimes it feels abusive. A time of killing and a time of war has a profound, very deep impact on your soul. If you're not up to it, you die. But you pay a price. Israeli society embraced a time of killing and a time of war. We didn't embrace it because we enjoyed it. We didn't embrace it because this is an experience we wanted to have. It was a reality that was forced upon us, and the question we all had to ask ourselves is what is our hineni at this moment? What is this? When is it that we say, I am here? And what does being here mean? And in some of the deepest and most, I don't know if the term is glorious or heroic or deep or remarkable dimensions of Israeli society, was the way our country said Hineni. And while you're not on a front line of a bomb or an attack, you are also on a front line. Some of it was psychologically even more difficult than Israel's. People who were your friends, people who shared your values, people who you saw as your allies, all of a sudden you couldn't even understand, what world am I living in? You saw me, I saw you, we talked. What became of you? What became of a world in which we thought that there was reason and argument And while we don't claim that there is a single truth, and while many of us believe that these and these are the words of the living God, we all remember that it says these and these are the words of the living God, and not those are the words of the living God. There's boundaries to pluralism. And part of what many of us experienced were statements from our closest friends, or from a universe in which we felt, what's happening here? Olam hafuch ani ro'eh. I'm feeling an upside down world. And so we created jokes sometimes about it, or amazements, or we stopped talking and we disconnected, but deep down. October 7th and its aftermath generated a profound sense of attack, both on an onslaught, not just to our physical well-being, but to our psychological sense of the world, both in Israel and around the world. And only a fool tries to ask who suffers more, whose is harder. It doesn't matter. This time of war has been a difficult time of war. And when you feel you're under attack, you naturally shut down. You naturally change your vision and your perspective. You create boundaries between those who are safe and those who are unsafe. You check all of those around you to see, are you one of us or are you not one of us? You create loyalty tests, not because you're small, but because you want to live. You want to claim your sanity. You want to claim your safety. Who could I be with? Who could I not be with? Who could I talk to? Because the people very often who I was most safe with are now the people I don't know who they're going to be. Who could I trust? Your focus changes, and your world gets smaller and smaller. And you primarily focus on your own well-being and on your own sanity and on those who will reaffirm and create a space where literally you can breathe. There's a time for everything under the sun, but not every one of these times is the same. The experience of a time of killing and a time of war is a profoundly, profoundly unnatural. The tragedy is that it is very natural. And we're trying to figure out, many of us, how natural this is. Is this natural? Is this our destiny? Is this the world? Is this our destiny here in the Middle East? Is this your destiny outside of Israel? Is everybody now anti-Semitic? Do I have any friends? Could I trust anybody? What does life look like? But Kohelet says to us, there's also another time. And the question I want to ask myself, and I want to ask you, the question I'm asking myself over and over again, is there is a sense of a cycle of time that's out of my hands. But is there cycles of time that are in my hands? How do I reclaim other times? How do I overcome a sense of determinism in my life and the cycle of time? Because I'm not going to get to pick when I die. But can I pick when I kill? And I can't always pick, but can I pick some of the time? And war is forced upon me. But could peace be something that I could work for? In the famous story of Hillel, we are taught that the essence of Judaism, the core feature of our tradition, that which defines Jewishness, is man da'alayich snei lechavrach lo ta'avid zohi kol haTorah kula v'ashar perusha hi zil gmor. What is hateful unto you, do not do unto others. That is the whole Torah, and the rest is commentary. Go and study. But I just lied to you. And we have all been lying to ourselves since this translation. Because what is hateful unto you, do not do unto others, is not a translation of Man da'alayich snei lechevrach lo ta'avid. But we like that translation. Or do we? It's not by accident that's not a translation built within, which was made in the Middle East. Hillel says, what's hateful unto you, do not do unto your friends. Chevrach is not an other, it's your friend. And the fundamental question that we have to ask ourselves as human beings is, who is our friend? Kant, in his categorical imperative, gives one answer. His answer is that it's not friends. The categorical imperative in one of its definitions states, act in such a way that you're willing for your behavior to be universalizable. There is no friend, it's a universalizable principle, which contains all human beings qua human beings. And another definition, always treat all human beings as an ends and never as a means. And that means, who's your chevrach? It really means all others. But that's not what Hillel says. And we all know that one of the great challenges of religion and nationalism is who is contained within your chevrach, your friend. And in a time of war and in a time of killing, your chevrach shrinks. Your chevrach is who's with you under the stretcher. Has anybody ever here been on a stretcher hike? Raise your hands. Like, talk to them. Because there's something very interesting about a stretcher hike. If you don't have 4, you don't just need 4, you need at least 8. And you probably need 12. Depends how good you are and how strong you are, or how young you are.
Or how much you weigh.
Or how much you weigh. I remember when I was in the Army, when I first drafted in basic training, I weighed 102 pounds. I was 6 feet and I weighed 102 pounds. I was probably, just for weight grounds, forget the fact that I was legally blind, I shouldn't have been a combat soldier, just for my weight. But as you know, I became a combat soldier because I cheated on my eye exam, whatever it was, that's what 18-year-old idiots do. But my friends loved it when I was on the stretcher. And I said, you know, what's hateful unto you, do not do unto others. I humbly agree. You know, if I would want someone light. I was like, whoever had me was like happy. And I do remember, back then in the Army, you were allowed to torture soldiers. You were allowed to torture them physically, you were allowed to torture them with food, and you were allowed to torture them emotionally. It was actually back then thought to be what makes you a good soldier. And our corporal got really good at trying to torture us. He had a whole thing. One of the things he would do is he would take a rock and he'd hold it like this. And he'd say, Ala tachat shev. You're in full battle gear, and he'd have a rock. And he'd open the rock, open his hand, and the whole group had to be on the ground before the rock hit the ground. And he would do this for an hour, 2 hours. Sometimes he'd pretend to open his hand. Sometimes and then we would all fall down. Our own little revenge happened when he thought that a bigger rock fell more quickly. Now, being a yeshiva student, I also thought that it would fall more quickly. because, you know, also it just so happened that whenever we studied physics, I was in my father's classes in university. So there's things in the world so I was all nervous. It turned out, wasn't so. But I do remember when he took us on a stretcher hike with only 4 people for over 2 hours. And you learn. But when you're at war, you want to know who's under the stretcher with you. Who's standing with you? Whether that war is here in Israel or whether that war, and it is a war. It's an attack, it's an onslaught that you're feeling around the world. Not from anti-Semitic acts, but from the intellectual, moral corruption of arguments and delegitimization. Who stands with you? And in war, your chevrach shrinks. And you look for who's going to be with you. I can't hold it anymore. And so you look who stood with you and who didn't stand with you. And those are your chevrach, and those are the people who you say, what's hateful unto you, I won't do to you. Religion naturally challenges this as well. Religion very often says, chevrach are my fellow Jews, my fellow Christians, my fellow Muslims. We all know that one of the great paradoxes of monotheism is the notion that one God loves one person or one people best. That somehow there is one God, creator of the universe, who only has enough love for one, and it's me. And so who's chevrach? Chevrach are my fellow Jews. Chevrach are my fellow Christians. Chevrach are my fellow Muslims. Religion naturally challenge. Re'acha, ahavta l're'acha kamocha, re'acha b'mitzvot. It naturally creates a hierarchy between people in which, who should I really care about? Who do I care about the most? Who should I care about first? Nationalism initially tried to change that distortion of religion. Nationalism, which emerges in Europe after a 300-year war in which over 1 million people were killed because over whether you were a Protestant or a Catholic. That was it. Over 1 million people, 300 years, the continent is fighting. And nationalism comes and says your religious identity is not what determines your chevrach. Nationalism says citizenship determines your chevrach. If you're a fellow citizen, and a fellow citizen is not limited exclusively to your religious affiliation. It's those who live, and there's different theories of what qualifies. Is it ethnic, as in Germany? Is it cultural, as in France? Is it amalgamation of the two? Is it thick culture, less culture? Is it just the fact that you were born within a certain border? And so nationalism says your chevrach are your fellow citizens. And it's only in Israeli discourse that people think that there is an issue. Is Israel a Jewish state or a state of all of its citizens? That is lunacy. Not only is it lunacy, it's not even coherent, because the concept of a state is a body constituted by its citizens. North Korea is the state of all of its citizens. It might not be a nice place to live, but all of its citizens are discriminated against equally. Every citizen, a state is always the state of its citizens. But we have learned that nationalism suffers from the same failure of religion. It could expand the parameters, but it doesn't fully get rid of discrimination. Multi-ethnic, multinational states, binational states, multiple loyalties create frameworks for discrimination. And also, clearly it shrinks chevrach only to your citizen. But sometimes it also creates numerous distinctions within your state. But without doubt, the greatest challenge of nationalism is to make sure that the loyalty, its definition of chevrach, doesn't exclude in too dramatic a way, or doesn't create prioritization in too corrupt a manner between your fellow citizen and the rest of the world. The difference between nationalism and ultranationalism, or nationalism and fascism, is that nationalism celebrates the fact that chevrach are your citizens, but that doesn't exhaust all of your moral responsibilities. There are cases that what's hateful unto you do not do to your fellow citizens, but there must be cases and instances in which what is hateful unto you do not do unto others. Nationalism demands loyalty, but it also requires some moral responsibility to people who are not your citizens. International aid is an example in which you recognize that there are people qua people who you want to help, and it doesn't always have to be in your national interest to determine who gets your foreign aid. When they're completely synced, then it's not really foreign aid. It's just an extension of your own self-interest. International Charter on Human Rights, and in particular on refugee rights, tells you that there's others who aren't your citizens who claim you. And that there are certain circumstances, of course you're supposed to distribute the goods of your society principally to your chevrach, to your citizens. But there are times when a person stands before you and their need is so great that if they return home, they're going to be killed or their life is going to be endangered, either because of their national identity, religious identity, or gender. International law requires you don't have to make them a citizen, but you can't send them back. They claim you. And so you have to stretch your chevrach. You stretch it in extraordinary circumstances. Because to be a human being is to recognize that you're not always supposed to distribute everything equally. There are cases when people claim you uniquely. One of the greatest limitations or expansions of limitations on national loyalty, or the expansion of chevrach, is actually in the doctrine of morality of war. The notion that there is a just war, or that you have to fight a just war justly, tells you that you're going to the battle against your enemy. You're in the midst of a time of killing and a time of war, and there's a way in which you're supposed to act rightfully, and there's a way in which you act unjustly. When you go to battle, even your enemy, even the person who wanted to kill you, the minute they raise their hands, the minute they do this, you have to see them. Under Israeli doctrine, you're only allowed, or the definition of a combatant who you can engage in a time of killing, is a person who has the means and the intent to harm you. If you have the means but not the intent, you're my friend. If you have the intent but not the means, you are classified in war as a civilian non-combatant. And you're not allowed to shoot. Doesn't mean that non-combatants don't die. And especially in wars in urban zones, non-combatants will die. But you don't target them. Your intent cannot be to kill them. And this Israeli code of ethic demands of all of its soldiers, you must do everything in your power to avoid harming them. Them being not civilians, who, by the way, might have an intent. They hate you. The Poles say they celebrate October 7th. Or a prisoner who raises his hands, or her hands. They had the intent, and they actually killed you yesterday. But the minute they do this, that means they don't have the means. The minute the means is taken away, they claim you, they activate a moral responsibility. The difference between nationalism and fascism is that in fascism or ultranationalism, your chevrach are uber alles. Your loyalty to your people transcends everything. There is no such thing as an unjust war, because war, if you have something that I want, you don't claim me ever. My needs are uber alles. There is no such thing as morality in war, as fighting a just war justly, because they don't claim me. And Itamar Ben-Gvir could stand up and say, I want to know why there are so many prisoners of war. Why haven't we killed more of them? Why didn't we shoot them beforehand? And it is the chief of staff of the Israeli army who says and reminds the soldiers, we don't shoot civilians and we don't shoot anybody who puts their hands up and surrenders. Now, there are circumstances we know in which people put their hands up and right behind them is somebody with an RPG. And so, okay, our soldiers have an impossible job, and the job of fighting a just world war justly is not what we agree upon here in the Beit Midrash of the Shalom Hartman Institute, but what a soldier could know in the midst of battle, in the midst of the heat of all of the uncertainty. But the challenge of nationalism is to create a chevrach which gives priority to your fellow citizens, but at the same time recognizes that human beings claim you. There is a time for loyalty to your citizens, and there's a time for loyalty to humanity qua humanity, and to know which time, because for everything there is time under the sun. But when nationalism, religion, and a time for killing come together, there is a perfect storm that challenges our moral universe. When those three are there, when nationalism is combined with religious identity, when war naturally shrinks your sense of responsibility, we have a profound inherent moral challenge to bring out the best of our tradition, to insulate our nationalism from ultranationalism, and to still think about, is it possible that there will be a time to heal? We are not in an easy time right now in Israel. For many of you, it's not an easy time either. For many, this conversation seems too early. For many, it might seem to be disloyal. In war, we naturally shrink our chevrach. In war, it's so difficult to keep nationalism from becoming ultranationalism. It's not intellectually difficult, it's psychologically difficult, and sometimes nearly impossible. As I've mentioned to many of you, we had an intense discussion here amongst all the staff of the Institute about our moral responsibilities to humanitarian aid to Gazans, involving a certain post that I wrote that upset tens of thousands of people, maybe hundreds of thousands of people, and many of my coworkers. And as we were talking about it, one of the senior staff of the Institute raised her hand and she says, Donniel, I'm not proud of it, but right now, I don't have any room in my heart to worry about Gazan civilians. And I said to her, if you told me you were proud of it, I would fire you. If you're not proud of it, I understand. I can understand. If you're not proud of it, it's at least coherent to talk about how do we get to the other time. I don't know where your souls are. And I'm not going to be, this class is not going to be standing in judgment of anybody, nor determining what you ought to be feeling right now. Personally, I'm trying to find a time to heal. For months now, I'm trying to reclaim a time for peace. I'm trying to ask, how do we expand our chevrach? Who is the other? Who is our friend who we believe we have moral responsibilities for? And that's what today's class is going to be about. It's not a class which asks you that you need to do this now. It's not a class which judges what is the right time. Life is simple in Ecclesiastes because there's a time for everything, and I don't know who determines that time. I don't know if it's God. I don't know if it's destiny. In general, I don't believe in a God who shapes history, nor do I accept the notion that there is destiny. I live under the myth of human agency, and it is a myth because it is completely false, but it's the myth that I want to believe in. But I want us to ask that question. It's the question at the heart of Zionism. It's one of the important questions that Israel's going to have to ask. How do we reclaim who I believe we ought to be? But just to be certain, to be clear, and I'm going to reiterate this later, one of the great challenges that sometimes in a time of killing you are led to believe is that morality endangers your life. That I can't have a moral responsibility in a time of killing because otherwise I'm going to die. And this is a time of killing means a time to set aside your moral responsibilities. I reject that categorically because, as I've taught here many times to you, a time of killing is not morally allowed, it's a moral obligation when you're engaging in self-defense. I make no excuses for my right to live, for my right to be safe. But very often you feel that tension. Now I understand a mother or a father. In this case, it was a mother who came to me and said, after I was speaking to a group of Israeli lay leaders about what about Gazans and civilians? What is the nature of the conversation? Who are we in this time of killing? And how do we think about ourselves? And she said to me, Donniel, I can't tell you, everything you were saying was speaking to my soul. So obviously I remembered her very well. And we said, you're so smart. More than smart, you're deep. But she says to me, Donniel, when my son comes home from Gaza, from time to time, I want to talk to him because I worry about what's happening to him. I worry about what he's experiencing and what he has to do. She says, Donniel, but I want to tell you I'm afraid. I'm afraid to talk to him about moral issues. Because what happens if my conversation causes him to hesitate? Welcome to Israel. Welcome to this country. How do you make that decision for somebody? How do you do that? What responsibility do you have at that moment? That's why I'm not telling anybody what to do. I just want us to study and to think. And each one of us is going to figure out what is the time. But we're not meant to only live in a time of killing and a time of war. And how do we fill the inevitable moral void, the inevitable shrinking of who is our chevrach at this time. It's inevitable. Has to happen. Psychological necessity. It's inevitable. But it's not our destiny to live in that forced universe. We can begin to think otherwise. And in the sources before you, I want to offer you 3 ideas that I'm thinking about. The first is, what does it mean and how do we function when we declare the primacy of the ethical? How does the primacy of the ethical, could that help us? Is it just words? Or are there ways in which we have to act? And here I want you to look carefully at the way Maimonides, in Laws of Slaves, interprets Hillel in Tractate Shabbat. Hillel says, what is hateful unto you, do not do unto your chevrach. How does the Rambam understand that? And how does he make sense of Jewish law, which shrinks chevrach? Also think very seriously about, what does Zohi Kol HaTorah Kula mean? What does this is the whole Torah mean? Because we know it's not the whole Torah. And just read Rashi, because Rashi reminds you that it's not the whole Torah, because there's a lot of God in our tradition too. But what does it mean when someone says, Zohi Kol HaTorah Kula? How could that idea, plus Maimonides, help us expand or fill a moral void? Because just to declare the primacy of the ethical is just words. What does it mean? What does it mean as a mode of action? That's the first issue I want you to think about. The second is I'd like you to think about the role of the outside critic at this time. Now, fascists have no outside critics. Very often, neither do we Jews, because we use anti-Semitism very, very expansively. What does it mean? How critical are outside critics? They're not your chevrach. What role do they have to play? For that, on the issue of criticism, you have source 4 and 5 on the role of the critic. But for this, I want you to read very carefully source 6. Read the Mishnah. Shor ish sheigach shorei ehu. When the ox of a person gores the ox of re'ehu, not another, your re'ah. The Mishnah distinguishes between 2 cases. One is priests who aren't re'ah because they're not equal, and one is the idolatrous non-Jew. Notice the way the Reisha of the Mishnah, the first part of the Mishnah, sees the implication and the symmetry required in the verse, Shor ish sheigach shorei ehu, and the lack of symmetry in the Seifa in the second part of the Mishnah. Once you notice that, go to the answer, the question that the Gemara asks, because they called to the Mishnah to task. Please look at the 2 answers offered in the Gemara. Just to make, in case some of you don't know, the word Harparan, the name Harparan, is Har Sinai. Har Sinai, Mount Paran means Mount Sinai, which means the moment that we are given the Torah. But then what I really want you to notice is the way the editors of the Talmud chose to end this sugya. What is the role of the Sargiotot? the Roman army officers. What is the Mishnah teaching us about the role and the necessity of critics for our understanding of who is Chevrach? Because our Mishnah is one of the most morally despicable Mishnahs. And it is a paradigm of how religion can shrink your Chevrach. And our Gemara is offering some thoughts about how it could be expanded. And then think about who are your Sarjotot, who are the Roman army officers in your life. And the last issue is utopia. What role does utopia have in expanding your chevrach, in expanding your moral horizons? Remember that utopia literally means nowhere. So it could be that it is actually quite destructive. Because our challenge is not to be moral in the end of days, but to be moral here. It's about expanding the moral void, not one day, but now or tomorrow. Read, I gave you here 4 different utopias. There are really 3. 2 are in Isaiah, which are very similar. There's a utopia of Zechariah, and there's the utopia of Maimonides in Source 10. Are there differences between the benefits or dangers of the different utopias? Is a utopia helpful at this moment in a time of war, in a time of killing? Or is a utopia profoundly dangerous? Are there different ways to think about utopia? The sources are, with the exception of Baba Kama, very, very textually easy. What's going to make them difficult is the extent to which you put yourself and ask questions in the text. What does it mean? Talk about your own desires and angst at this moment. How does this help me expand? Do I even want to expand? How do I? I can just say that how we answer this question is going to determine, in my belief, the future of Zionism. The future of Zionism here in Israel and the ability of Zionism to win around the world. Think about those questions. Use these sources as a resource for you to engage and to think. And I'll see you back here at 11. Thank you. Hillel's greatest innovation is not in his statement, Mandalaich snei lechevrach lo ta'avid. It's not in saying this core ethical Torah. Nor is it even in his statement, Zohi kol haTorah kula. The prophets, over and again, said a similar statement in which they declared the primacy of the ethical. Hillel is not the one who innovated the idea of the primacy of the ethical. The prophets did. They gave it primacy. They quickly weighed it over and above other aspects of our tradition. And say, they're the ones who said, Ma Elohim mevakesh mikem. What does God want from you? This is what God wants from you. Declaring the primacy of the ethical is very, very critical. But it's inert unless you come up with a methodology to activate it. Now, talking about it is important. And the first stage of filling the moral void is talking about what are your priorities. But talking about your priorities is not enough. Because we could talk about ourselves, but are we acting that way? We're the most moral people in the world. We have the most moral army in the world. You could say a lot of things. Words matter. Because when you say something enough, it shapes your behavior, but it is not enough. Hillel's critical innovation, I believe, whether he was aware of it or not, doesn't matter to me, is in his term, Vashar Perushahi, and the rest is commentary. What does that mean? What does it mean the rest is commentary? I believe what Hillel is saying is that, of course, Judaism has non-ethical features to it. Of course, Judaism is not just about doing the good. But when he says that all the rest is but commentary, he is requiring of you to institute in your life a check and balance on your religious observance, in which everything is judged at the end of the day through its moral consequences. That doesn't mean that at every moment there's a moral dilemma. Should I eat kosher? Should I not eat kosher? Okay, should I eat an animal or not? Could be. But should I eat kosher? Should I not eat kosher? Should I observe Shabbat or should I not observe Shabbat? Should I pray? Should I not pray? But throughout your religious life, there's going to be moments where it's not simply sufficient to say, yes, the essence of Judaism is the ethical, because you don't want to reduce all of Judaism to the ethical. But the question is, when there's a conflict, when there's a moral issue on the table, Hillel is giving an instruction to rabbis and to the tradition in which everything you do has to be seen through its impact on the ethical. And when there is a conflict, it's your job to interpret it through the prism of the ethical. That's Vashar Perushahi. The ethical is not a declaration. It has to claim your actions, and it has to reprioritize the way you think. Now, I'm not saying that I was right when I did this, but I remember using this very early on when I was a rabbi in a JCC on the Palisades in Tenafly, New Jersey in 1984. And I remember deciding that there wasn't going to be any Jew's home that I wasn't going to eat in. I just decided. Wasn't going to be. My kashrut could not create a boundary in which I couldn't eat in somebody's home. Now, I wasn't going to eat treif, but I was going to work it out. Now, I said, okay, there's kashrut, and I'm committed to kashrut. And I'm committed to the Jewish people. What's my obligation to someone who invites me to their home? Now, that's a minor little case. But what happens when something, the moral code, is the perush which every act you do has to answer? And it's not that orthodoxy is particularly challenged on this. It's that orthodoxy just does a lot of halacha. It's not like they're less morally sensitive. It's not true. They just have a lot of halachic stuff going on. They have a lot of halachic stuff going on. And, what should I do? The Erev is down, and I'm stuck in the middle with my carriage. Are you going to start? How do you think about? There's just all these rules that meet you all the time, so they're more challenged. But all of us, whatever it is that we do. Now, how do you not reduce Judaism to the ethical and still make the ethical the key interpretive justification or test for everything that you do? Now, when you reduce it to the ethical, in many ways, it breaks with the tradition. So, there is a profound value to talk a certain way. I used to hate tikkun olam. I was a Tikkun Olam hater. I was, and I made a lot of enemies for it. I even once said it in my podcast, and I got one of the nastiest emails back. How dare you? And I understood. I was a Tikkun Olam poo-pooer because, first of all, I don't know how to repair a world, so it was just too big for me. Like, I didn't know what to do. I know how to repair a neighborhood, a street. I just couldn't even handle it. I just don't even know what I'm supposed to do with it. Like, it just sort of was like, I felt it was just words. And of course, there's all those who hate Tikkun Olam because, you've reduced all of Judaism to Tikkun Olam, and without the particular, there's how could you just have universal, and how Tikkun Olam replaced tzedakah. That whole story, I gave lots of speeches again, which deeply moved me. But there's something very powerful about a Jewish people who says that the central value of Judaism is Tikkun Olam. Something very powerful about it. With all of its challenges, something powerful. If that's what you say, and if you talk about it enough, it's going to impact your behavior. And it's not by accident that Tikkun Olam is almost not discussed here in Israel, post the creation of the state. Herzl, pre-state, big Tikkun Olam. So there is a value to talking. But what's more important is how you operationalize it. And this is what the Rambam does. And he gives us a key direction. When you want to speak and fill a moral void, when you want to claim the primacy of the ethical, you don't just say this is the central value. You actually also have to use ethics as the vehicle through which you interpret all of the Torah. And that's what he does. The Rambam in Yichot Avadim gives us an example of what Hashar Perusha Hizil Gmor. Because he knows, Mutar la'avod be'eved kna'ni b'farech. It's allowed. It says there's nothing I could do. Leviticus 25 is not even embarrassed. They're not even embarrassed to use the same term that Paro applied to us. Jews, Avdu B'farech, we're not even sensitive because that's what happens when your chevrach is so shrunk. When your chevrach is shrunk, mandalaych, what's hateful unto you, don't do to your friends, but you're not my friend, so I could do to you what was done to me. V'avta tager kigera, never happens that way. What was done to me, I do to others. That's the way we always are, or many of us are. And when our Torah says, what Pharaoh did to you was not a failure. You're allowed to do it to them. It's permissible. And he knows it's literally, he can't deny that it's there. But the sentence, which is a Judaism-changing sentence, Va'af al pi shahadin kach, midat chasidut v'darkei chokhmah, sheyeh adam rachman v'rodef tzedek. The Rambam says the Torah is not equivalent to Midat Chasidut and Derech Chokhmah. Just let that sit. People who we are the masters of Torah and the teachers of Torah. And the Rambam tells you the Torah is not Derech Chokhmah and Chasidut. Where is the Derech Chokhmah and Chasidut? The Derech Chokhmah and Chasidut is in what's hateful unto you, do not do unto others. And the Torah shrunk who's our chevrach, and the Rambam says, the idolatrous slave is my chevrach. So how do I deal with a legal system that doesn't say that? How do I justify that? So Maimonides has a whole layer of explanations in which he basically argues that the written Torah was given to a primitive group of ignoramuses. And for a primitive group of ignoramuses, it's not bad. It's the best they could have heard, and it's the best they could handle. But that's what you want to be? That's who you want to be? Don't hide behind what's written. Don't hide behind legal codes and legal arguments. What's your derech chokhmah and your derech hasidut? That's Operation in Hillel. It's saying that when you don't live in pure legalistic formal arguments, it applies to the Torah. It also applies to international law. And so much of our defense of Israel is over legalistic. Humanitarian aid. Should I worry about Gazans? And the post that I wrote was when 120 Gazans there was a stampede, and they died. Some might have been shot. How responsible we were, it doesn't matter. How guilty we were. I wrote a post, we are responsible. I said, even if we didn't do it, we're responsible for what happens under our watch. And I referenced too nuancingly Eglarufa, the laws of the broken neck, heifer, whatever it is. Heifer. Eglarufa. For what happens under your watch, you're responsible. Besides the death threats and the attacks and all the above that came from it. We said, what are you talking about? Which country in the world feeds its enemy? When was there another country in the world? And now we become experts and we are analyzing everyone else's wars. Bombing Dresden, bombing Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Look at America, Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan. We're quoting. Tal is smart enough to start talking to me about some African country that I never heard of. And 400,000 people died there yesterday. And I'm not belittling it, but what's your opinion about the war in northern Eritrea and Ethiopia? I didn't know that Eritrea and Ethiopia are next to each other. Maybe they're not, maybe they are. I take Charles on his word. But I know. How come you're not talking about that war? Where were you? How come those 400,000 and why is it that these 37,000 and you're not minusing the Hamas people? Why am I responsible for a community, 80% of whom say that October 7th was wonderful? Why am I responsible for a community that clearly doesn't share any of my moral codes with me? Who want me dead? Who celebrate my death? Who try to attack and stampede hostages even when they're being released? This is my concern with Donniel. You care about them? International law states that when you're at war, you don't have a responsibility to feed your enemy. You do have a responsibility to allow food to enter, but it's not on you. And if your enemy is using that food that you're trying to give to the civilian population, and therefore it's furthering and strengthening the opposition, international law does not require that you provide that aid. That's during a war. Occupation, you are required and obligated to provide food. What is Gaza? Gaza's war, Gaza's occupation. What's our responsibility? Well, international law, which army in the world ever fed its enemies? Af al pi she'adin kach midat chasidut v'darkei chokhmah. Since when are we a people who are stuck by what's formally required? Now, I understand why we're doing it. Because double standards feels and smells anti-Semitic. And I understand it. And so when I'm debating somebody else, that's one thing. When I'm debating someone who's clearly defined with double standards and applies things to Israel that they don't apply, forget to other people, to themselves, it's just not even, that's one thing. But I'm talking about an inner conversation. I'm talking about us. What am I supposed to do to terrorists? What are they called? The Nukba? What's the name of the unit? Not Nakba. Nukhba. Are we required to have the Red Cross come to a Nukhba prison? Sde Teiman. Have you all heard of Sde Teiman? If you haven't, Google it. What should Sde Teiman be? It was a jail set up for Nukhba terrorists. Are terrorists prisoners of war? Prisoners of war. If they're terrorists, this is not prisoners of war. So it's not war, so something else applies? So I'm supposed to conduct myself in Gaza according to the rules of war, but once I capture them, I'm not supposed to? I can make that argument. They're not army. They're terrorists. I'm going to give them as much food as they're giving my hostages. The dominant position in Israeli society is that why should I feed them where my kids are still prisoners? I can understand it. But part of claiming that you are defined by the ethical is going beyond the requirement of the law. Part of the requirement of defining your identity in terms of ethical behavior is recognizing your responsibility to go beyond the requirement of the law. That is the Rambam, and that's what Hillel said, Vashar Perushahi. That's what it means. Now, I'm not giving a halachic ruling on what we have to do in every instance. Who shall we be? There's 2 million people there. There's 2 million people there. Is it war? Is it occupation now? They have no system, an existing government to enable distribution. They have nobody to look after them. Should humanitarian aid be an American agenda or an Israeli agenda? And it turns out if you speak to Tal, we've actually been doing a lot of stuff, but just again, we don't talk about it. Because if we talk about it, what are they going to say? You know, there's always somebody. Who's the they? The Rambam makes it very clear. En ha'achzariyut v'azut mitzuya ela ba'akum uvdei avodah zarah, aval zar'o shel Avraham Avinu v'hem Yisrael she'ishbi'a lem HaKadosh Baruch Hu tovat HaTorah v'tziva otam b'chukim u'mishpatim. Who are we? Tzadikim v'rachmanim hem ala kol. Now you know the old joke about, I don't know if it's a joke, but the story about the Hasidic Rebbe, who all the Hasidim are talking about him as if you didn't believe our Rebbe did this, and my Rebbe did this, and my Rebbe did this, and he's just unbelievable. And there's a misnaged there, and he's listening to these people, and at the beginning he's listening, and after time he's getting doubtful, and at some point he's getting nauseous. Like, really? Like, do you actually believe all these things you're saying about your Rebbe? They say, of course not. But I like following somebody who people say something like that about him. If that's the way they talk about such a person, that's someone I'm going to follow. Is this who we are? Of course we're not. But what happens when people say this is who I am? Now it does get translated into Jewish law, in which when a person lives in a Jewish community, you're not supposed to check their Jewishness. If they're living in the community, they have a default of Jewishness under Jewish law. You don't carry Jewish books. You don't carry books. If you're living in the community, you have a presumption of Jewishness. However, if you're argumentative and nasty to people, they say, check their lineage. That's like, it's a beautiful, it's actually a halachic translation of a mythic principle. But who are we? In the midst of war, chavrach shrinks. In the midst of war, you hold on to anything you can. And when international law attacks you, you claim it's anti-Semitic. And when international law legitimizes you, you say, look, what do you want from me? You're not living by it, you're duplicitous. This is like we actually do that all the time. All the time. ICC will go to the ICC to bring people on trial, but when ICC attacks us, they're anti-Semitic, duplicitous, how dare you. You play both of those games, and I understand it. But the Rambam somewhere along the line says, what does it mean to be a Jew? And one of the ways in which we fill our moral void is go back to that question. Ask that question. Who am I? Don't let them define you. Don't let them take away from you the essence of who you are. Don't be so angry that you forget your neshama. Now that doesn't mean you should endanger your life. But there's a difference between attacking and defending against duplicitous anti-Semitic blood libels and enabling that conversation to others to define our own inner conversation with ourselves. I am telling you, I am living now 9 months in Israel, in which outside of the army is having this conversation all the time. The larger Israeli public, and certainly Israeli politicians, have not put forth a question of Mahu Derech HaChochmah or Midat HaChasidut. Who are we supposed to be? And it's time. And unless we don't start talking that way, we're never going to be able to get out of a time of war and a time of killing. And it is exactly the same legalism that the Rambam attacks in the Torah that we have to look at when it comes to international law and the facts and figures that we use as a foundation of core Israel advocacy. What is it that when we win the battle and we're going to lose the war over our identity? The first is the centrality of the ethical, but how it gets activated. And the Rambam tells you how to do it. And ask yourself, how do we do it? The second principle is the principle of the significance and critical importance of critics. Now, our tradition makes criticism into one of the 613 mitzvot. To be a Jew, to go under the stretcher to your chevrach means that when they do something bad, you tell them. Because I'm not only responsible to save your life, I'm responsible to help you grow morally and spiritually and to save you from yourself. How you talk, it's the law. It's a pasuk in Vayikra and the Rambam, it enters the Mishnah Torah. It is. It's the law. But it's very hard. It's very hard. Because we hate critics. We hate them. We say to somebody who's a critic, what do Chazal say? Before you tell me to get rid of my little stick, get rid of the beam between your eyes. Who are you to tell me? What does it mean to be a critic? It's so easy to discount every criticism because who is worthy to really stand in judgment over somebody else? And since we know that, we're able to use it all the time. Who are you to tell me? You're not there, your kids aren't on. Who are you? And in fact, Michael Walzer speaks about how all social critics have to be insiders. The problem is, the minute you become a critic, we make you an outsider. That's what we do with anti-Semitism. I'm not talking about those who are anti-Semites. I'm talking about the way we use anti-Semitism. Biden became an anti-Semite. Really? You became an anti-Semite. After every single freaking thing that you did, coming here, making us feel seen and safe. How it is that we felt with the aircraft carriers here. What did we feel when you put together a coalition and we didn't have to stand against Iran by ourselves? The thousands and thousands of airlifts that you brought. And when you dared to say to us, I'm not giving you 2-ton bombs or 1-ton bombs to be used on Rafiach until in which time you tell me how you're going to deal with the civilian population. anti-Semite. I'm not saying you should like him. I'm not claiming that everything, there's a lot of stuff. Really? Anti-Semite? Shame on us. Shame on us. Because that's what you do. You shut it down. The mitzvah bocheach tochiach is not just a mitzvah which is trying to teach you to take responsibility. It's also creating a society in which social criticism is seen as an essential part of developing a moral and spiritually excellent people. And then we come to our Gemara. Our Gemara is exactly what happens when you see yourself in a small, insulated community and you define your chevrach as Jews. And you don't even bother defining reacha as Jews. You don't even have an argument. You'll just use whatever you can. And in your Beit Midrash, in our court of law, we win. In our court of law, only Jewish lives matter and only Jewish property matters. And if you are an idolater, you just don't count. And if I can get away with it, you're going to pay full damages and I'm not going to pay anything. And even though it's inconsistent with the ruling that re'acha has to be a two-edged process, it applies for the one who damages just as it applies for the one who is damaged. And the law only applies when there is symmetry between those two people. But you say, I don't care. And notice the most difficult thing about the Seifa of the Mishnah, in the Reisha where it says that when a cow gores the cow of Hegdesh, something that was sanctified for the temple, or the temple or a sanctified cow gores that of an Israelite, patur, they explain it to you. They have to explain, because it says shoreacha. Notice in the Seifa, in the second part of the Mishnah, there's not even an explanation. They don't even offer an answer. Because also when you're talking to yourself, you can get away with everything seems reasonable. There's no checks and balances. Yeah, they're idol, yeah. Why? What do you mean, why? What do you? Also, I get full damages and exemption. Why? I'm there. And then along comes the Gemara and they ask. They say, what's wrong with you? They don't ask. It's not a moral criticism. It's an internal halachic. Like, you can't do this. You yourself told me in the Reisha that reacha means something. And if there is the absence of reacha, there's an absence of responsibility for damages on both sides. What are you doing? And then our Gemara gives an answer. Our Gemara gives the deepest answer of a limited definition of chevrach. What does it say? Why? Why don't we have to? Why could we take their money? It's not us. It's God. God gave it to me. What, you're more pious than God? God gave it to me. When did God give you their money? Oh, you don't know? Oh, let me tell you. I have so many things to tell you. I have so many facts and figures that you don't know. Don't you know there's a fact that there's the 7 Noachide commandments? Oh, of course it's a fact. How do I know it's a fact? Because it's in the Midrash in an analysis of Genesis 2. Once it's in the Midrash analyzing Genesis 2. Mikol etz hagan achol tochal. U'me'etz hagan whatever. Lo tochal mimenu ki yom achlecha mimenu mo tamut. Great. We're talking about a tree, and from there we learn the 7 Noachide commandments. It's pshat in the Torah. Of course you knew it. Who doesn't know? So mainly you want to make the 7 Noachide commandments about stealing and murder and about courts and not cursing God. Fine, knock yourself. It's fine. It's clear. And actually the 7 Noachide commandments might be a great idea. It's an idea which says that God has a covenant with the world. God doesn't only have a relationship with Jews. The problem with the 7 Noachide commandments is that no non-Jew could keep them. By definition, because one of the 7 Noachide commandments prohibits idolatry. So what are they supposed to do? We basically say to them, this is who you are. You're supposed to have no religion. You're not Jews, but don't have anything. Now, even the Jews worshipped idols. What were you expecting of the non-Jews? So now we're saying, but in our base medrash, we have a fact, the 7 Noachide commandments. Didn't you read Genesis 2? And didn't you know that they accepted them? How do we know that they accepted them? Because you wouldn't be allowed to punish somebody unless they accepted it. Therefore, they accepted it. So now that we know that there is a law, and they know there is such a law, and that we know that they accepted it, and now we know that they're not observing it, and how do we know? Because by definition, you can't observe them. Therefore, God basically says, Jews, take their money. And in your base medrash, it works. A decent man, Rabbi Shimon ben Manasseh, not Shimon ben Manasseh, excuse me, Rabbi Abau says it, and nobody argues. The only argument is, no, it's not from there, it's somewhere else. Nobody questions it. It's not from there. But in our base medrash, if you're arguing and you're trying to, of course you argue. Sounds good? Great, good. At least now we know why we do it. It's not our own corruption. Chas v'shalom, we're the most moral people in the world. Just God gave it to us. We're doing God's work. Along comes Rabbi Yochanan, who says, Rabbi Abau, nah, it's not that. It's when God, Hofia Bahar Paran, Mehar Paran, when God appears at Mount Sinai, Hofia also can mean hetir. God gave us their money. That means the moment of Jewish election at Sinai, the non-Jewish world no longer matters for God. They don't have to sin. The non-Jewish world's sin is not that they don't keep the 7 Noachide commandments. The non-Jewish world's sin is that they're not Jews. And in God's world, only Jews count. Okay, how does that sound? That sounds pretty good. Yeah, okay, now I got it. You're not Jews. The essence of election meant that my life is more important. Doesn't that what it means when God says, Anochi Hashem Elohecha, asher hotzeticha me'eretz Mitzrayim mibet avadim, lo yu lecha Elohim acharim al panai? It means that because you and I have a unique relationship, you're the one who I choose. And Deuteronomy 4, when God says, don't look up to the stars in the heavens and worship those stuff, that's what I gave to them. But you, I took out of Egypt. And in Michal's class, you saw the readings of Genesis 12. But Genesis 12 is not necessarily a universalist reading. It's interesting, nobody in the religious Zionist community gives Genesis 12 its pshat. Because Genesis 12, which says, I will bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you, means that God, will relate to the world on the basis of how they relate to you. It's interesting, religious Zionism picks a universalist language against the pshat and then creates particularist after the fact. But it was available. God only loves the Jews. So, yeah, that's what Sinai means. Okay, Chavrach are only the Jews. And there is no debate about the legitimacy of this argument. Actually, if you looked further on, they say, no, there's also another Braita which says the whole thing. Great. It said, come and we've had a question. For one moment, we doubted our moral superiority. Question asked, question answered, until you opened up your Beit Midrash. And when you let someone else into your Beit Midrash, all of a sudden someone's looking at you. You don't let Roman officers into your Beit Midrash. You let a mirror into your Beit Midrash. Mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the fairest of them all? And when you control the mirror, you know the language. But when you let somebody else in, and the text is very careful, because your natural instinct could be to look at them as whom? Anti-Semites. Romans, what are they? They're just doing to manipulate. They're just looking to try to find. So the text is careful both at the opening and at the ending when it says, Shanu. What is the text? Shanu. Wait a second. Lamdu, Shanu v'shilshu. Karu, Shanu v'shilshu. Now in the Jewish tradition, you're only supposed to study it twice. You're supposed to study everything twice. They did it a third time. They took it very seriously. The text wants to tell you, don't discount them. Don't claim, you're duplicitous Romans who don't care. Shanu, karu, shanu, v'shilshu. And at the end, when they found something bad, the text ends by saying, but we're not going to tell on you. Don't waste your opportunity here, because there's somebody who you have to bring into this base midrash. And the text says, I want to tell you, this is not a halachic legal correction. You can't do it, because when we control the law, we're going to end with the crap that we came up with. We're going to stay in the Mishnah. When no one else enters in, it's going to seem just fine for you. But let somebody else in the Beit Midrash. And they're going to tell you, really? All of your Torah is true? But this? But we say, 1 second, didn't you read the Gemara? Don't you realize why? When you bring someone else in the Beit Midrash, a lot of your answers no longer hold water. They no longer hold water. When the Meiri is living in the Middle Ages, and he's living in the midst of a non-Jewish world who's watching him. And this is sometimes when anti-Semitism and being a minority is of value. He's sitting and he knows that people are watching. He says, this doesn't apply to our Muslims and Christians. He says, this only applies to barbarians. Anybody who's gadur begidrei hadatot is my chevrach, is my re'ehu. The sarjotot come and say, am I counted as your chevrach? Your Torah is true, except for when you have a definition of chevrach that only includes Jews. Now, when we're at war, it's really hard. What's the right time to criticize in a time of killing? Again, I want to tell you, nobody knows. Nobody knows, and I'm not claiming to know. And maybe a bunch of things that I said were wrong. What could people hear and what they can't hear? But I do know that if we create a Jewish community and an Israeli society who, because we're in the midst of war, whether that war be here or that war be against duplicitous anti-Semitic attacks against our essential moral right to be, there has to be a time of healing. But a time of healing only comes when there's somebody who talks to you, who can tell you you're doing something wrong. I had that gift. I have no great I don't hold myself in any high regard. I'm a normal person. But I had a gift this war. And that gift was you. And that gift was Israeli Arab Palestinians. They were my gift. I came in the end of November to lecture in America. And I was in a synagogue in Washington. And I spoke about war, just war. And someone raised their hand and asked me, how does this apply? What do you feel about all the Gazan civilians? And I have to tell you, by end of November, no one yet in all of Israel had even raised that question. It didn't even appear on our radar screen till February. Didn't appear. Our newspapers, I felt like I was in Pravda. They were all talking to each other, and anybody who didn't speak about, who even claimed something Yair Lapid tells me that when I said I'm concerned about Gazan civilians, he said my polls dropped by 2 seats. I just mentioned the words. Once our prime minister made a statement. Once. We don't have a war against the Palestinian people. We just don't talk about it. Nobody. It's not even on the radar screen. But because I live with you, and you live with other people, you're the Meiri. You're living with other people who are asking, who aren't assuming. You are living a different war and being challenged differently. And when you talked, it had a very deep moral impact on me. I needed you. I couldn't have taught what I taught this last year if it wasn't for the fact that I spoke to you. I didn't see it on my own. You did. But it wasn't just you. A number of years ago, as you know, we made a decision here at the Hartman Institute to invest in a very significant way on the relationship between Israeli Jews and Israeli Arab Palestinians or Palestinians who are citizens of Israel. And you met Rana this week. I would not be who I am today if it wasn't for Rana. Rana sat in my office on a regular basis and said to me, Donniel, I'm embarrassed for you. And it was tough. And I said to her, listen, Rana, I want to talk to you, but I want to tell you, our objective is not to reach an agreement. Rana, this is a just war. And she would say, I know it's a just war when it started. But after a few days, it stopped. And I would say, allow me to disagree. And she would say, but what about all the people who are being killed? I don't even know about them. In every single war and operation in Gaza over the last 15 years, every night, the head of the Air Force and the head of Air Force operations would show up on TV and talk about what was attacked and what was bombed. I don't know what the official count now is, 40,000, 25,000 strategic military targets. No one ever talked. No, I never doubted. But really? Yes. We now attacked 70, 200, 400, 500 strategic military targets tonight from the air. No one ever said, what are we doing? There hasn't been one conversation about what we are doing. Now, I'm not saying it was wrong. It was wrong. I'm just noticing the absence. And it's only when Blinken and Biden, and of course they're the anti-Semites, because they're our friends who are now, when the other people critique us, plague on all your houses. Here, when Blinken has the chutzpah to get up and to say that October 7th doesn't justify dehumanizing Gazans, what do I do with that statement? Israeli Arab Palestinians, who are my friends, talked to me, and they aggravated me. They aggravated me. And my fellow co-workers and other people constantly said, fire them. Over and again, fire them. This person, he didn't condemn October 7th sufficiently in my mind. Get rid of him. This person is claiming that Israel's committing genocide in Gaza. Fire him. We started watching their posts, their Facebook stuff. I told Rana, I have your back. You say whatever you want. Your job is to aggravate the Jews. We need you. And Rana said to me, and said to our whole board in December, when Jews come to me and ask me to condemn October 7th, I don't know what to do. Not because I can't condemn October 7th. Of course I condemn October 7th. Of course this was barbaric and unexcusable. Of course I reject Hamas. But when you come to me, you're not asking me to condemn October 7th. You're asking me to prove to you my humanity. And I refuse to do that. I am not going to, my humanity is not up for judgment by you. You know me. And I said to you, Rana, I know you, and therefore whatever you say is here. I know your humanity. And when Rana said that statement, you have to understand it, that I always have to see the universe first and foremost through your pain and not through my pain. Listen, okay, in my base medrash, why not? Yeah. After October 7th, yeah, I'm in a lot of pain right now. I understand it. But if we could open up our hearts to listen, we don't have to think that the outside critic has all the wisdom in the world. They don't have. They're just as biased as we are. When Palestinians talk about October 7th, they're a product of the news sites that they read. But listen, maybe they have something that you want to hear. The Gemara in Baba Batra tells us that without the Sargiotot, you'd be stuck in a belief that God gave you all non-Jewish money. You'd be stuck there. Do you have a Sargiotot? Who do you have? Do you allow anybody to criticize you? Israelis right now have tremendous difficulty. We don't have anybody. And there's consequences. I want to add one other feature which might aggravate some, but that's my job. I don't believe that you are some prophetic moral voice in the Jewish world meant to save Israelis. But you see things because you're in a different place. It's not for naught that you translate as the default, what's hateful unto you, do not do unto others. It's not for naught. It's actually a beautiful move. It's a remarkable move. It's a move that will only happen when there's a minority in a diaspora. But there's a value to that Torah. There's a Torah of North American, English, European, South American, South African. Did I get everybody? Sorry. The world. There is a value. What happens when you produce a Torah when you're not the majority? What happens when you produce a Torah in which what goes on in your Beit Midrash is open to outside critics? What happens when you're being criticized all the time? Now, sometimes it gets too much, and sometimes you just want to come to Israel on vacation. You're the only ones who actually want to come here on vacation. You just want to be free. You want to be in a world where, yes, I'm right. I want to be in my Beit Midrash where no one is telling me all the time that the world is upside down. It's true. But there's a great value to your Torah. I want to tell you, and I don't know how to do it, but I want to tell you that when love for Israel means that you're quiet, Zionism becomes mediocre. Now, Tal Becker, in his interview with Yehuda, said in November, what do you want from North American Jews? And Tal said, at this time, I don't need you to be my moral critics. I need you to be my friends. That was correct in November. By June, I believe it's no longer correct. How do you do it? Nobody knows. There is a core rule distinction that I've offered for many years from Sidney Morgenbesser, and that's the distinction in which it's not that you tell Israelis what to do, you tell Israelis what you think. It's a very big difference. The only people who should decide what we do are people who vote here. It's our government and it's people whose kids are in the army. I'm not asking you to tell me what to do. Tell me what you think. And I need to be open enough to hear and I'll decide. But I need that voice. And when liberal Judaism and liberal Zionism in North America only know how to galvanize support for, or to quote Yehuda, when Zionism is about loyalty and not about imagination, it's not about challenging. You have to be a voice in this conversation, and Israelis aren't interested. They want you to shut up. They want you to shut up and come here. But because that's what they want, it doesn't mean that's what Israel needs. We are desperately in need of people to talk to who are going to tell us when the emperor has no clothes. And it could be the emperor has clothes and you're wrong. I'm not claiming that, from 6,000 to 10,000 miles away, you have a perspective of the truth. Crap, you don't have. You have a perspective. We need a Beit Midrash which is open. And one of the critical roles of world Jewry is to find a way to let their voice be heard. And it's very hard. Because at this moment, some of the voices that are coming forth are the voices of anti-Semites, are the voices of idiots, are the voices of morally duplicitous, corrupt people. And when you say the same thing, are you joining them? How do you even make the distinction in the noise? Now, again, I'm not saying I believe now is the time. You might believe not yet. In 3 months, I'm with you. When is the time? We need Sargiotot. And you're the best because you're not Sargiotot. You're us, but in another Beit Midrash. Israelis last year learned about your insignificance because judicial reform demonstrations would not have been possible without you. You put forth pressure and leverage far beyond what we had here in Israel. Netanyahu laughed. He said, you have 200,000? No problem. Bring out 500,000. Bring out 750,000. I have 2 million voters. I don't care how many people you have in Kaplan. But there were certain economic and military elites, but these economic elites in particular connected to funders and Jews around the world who spoke with their presidents and spoke with their investors and all of a sudden there was a coalition which won. They couldn't even put forth the override clause. You don't even remember what it was. Last year we were all experts in Israeli judicial reform. One of them was this override clause. I spoke all about it. Override clause, that a simple majority, that a majority in the Knesset, which means the government, could override anything the Supreme Court says. No problem. That means the end of democracy. We now have a totalitarian regime run by the majority. There are no checks and balances. This was the only thing that the Haredi parties wanted. They didn't care who sits in the Supreme Court. They think whoever sits in the Supreme Court is like a monkey. Literally, that's what they say. Put any monkey you want. I just want to know that whenever your monkeys decide whatever it is that they decide, I'm in the government who could override whatever they do. That legislation wasn't even brought up for a vote. Because it was a partnership. And Israelis saw your value. October 7th, you're not under the stretcher. You're not. But the truth is, you also are. And I'm not talking about the $1 billion of UJA. That's big money. It's not the money. You're our greatest political asset and ally. You're the ones who make us feel that we're normal and that we're not alone in the world. You're the ones who make us feel that someone has our back. You're the ones who speak and use whatever soft power you have to influence and to bring things to bear for the benefit of Israel. Your voice is also critical. I don't have a Torah on how to do it. I don't. But I know that our community has to talk about how that Torah is developed. Because without that, Israel is going to have a definition of chevrach, which is not worthy of the Jewish people. And finally, utopia. I hated utopias because I felt that they were morally destructive. I would meet Israelis, and I would, I'm a two-statist, I'm dying. I feel religiously obligated to end the occupation. I feel that Israel and Zionism is not complete as long as the Palestinian people do not have a home. I don't want it. I'm not willing to have a Palestinian state. I feel obligated, religiously obligated, by what is hateful unto you, do not do unto others, to have a Palestinian state. I don't always know how to do that, but I know what I want. But when I would present the two-state solution or whatever it might be, people would say to me, well, I'm also a two-statist. Do you know when? When the wolf will lie down with the lamb, and I'm the wolf. When will there be a two-state solution? When chitatu charvotam li'itim. When swords are turned into plowshares. When I don't need an army anymore. When I don't have to build a wall, when I don't have to defend it, I'm all for a two-state solution. When Palestinians will embrace Israel to the extent that I don't need an army, then I want a two-state solution too. I'm all in, because please remember, no one in the world loves peace more than me. And I saw that and I said, the problem with utopian visions is they disempower us in this world. They create a place. What's utopia? It means nowhere. They create a nowhere that I don't live in, and they disempower here and now. So everybody wants peace, and everybody wants to be lovely and moral, but until these conditions aren't fulfilled, leave me alone. And so I began to hate these texts until this year. Until I began to realize something that's been going on in Israeli society now, on and off, and getting more over the last 20 years. Something that's defined the prime ministership of Netanyahu, but also Gantz and Lapid are no different. We don't talk about what we want anymore. You know what I began to realize? The notion that utopia is nowhere? It's not true. Utopia is in my mind. And it's in my heart. It is somewhere. It's somewhere. What is it that the Jewish people did for 2,000 years when we said next year in Jerusalem? Who is more utopian than the Jewish people? Since the Second Intifada, we no longer have utopian dreams. We don't talk about it. That's one of the reasons why we have difficulty even talking about Gaza. We don't, what do you mean? We know exactly why it won't work. I could give you a list on every single point why it's a utopia and it's not relevant. Forget that the lion or the wolf doesn't lie with the lamb. You want me to make peace with people who 80% of them are still saying Hamas is wonderful? You want me to make peace with people who are raising their children this way? You want me to build a new Middle East with the Palestinian Authority in control of Gaza when the Palestinian Authority pays money to anybody who kills a Jew? You want to talk about a new Middle East on the basis of the old Middle East? Let them fix their books. Let them fix what they teach their kids. Let them fix their newspapers. Let them fix everything. Let him have a president who actually is not in his 19th year of his 4-year presidency. Give me something and I'll talk to you. This is the hope for the Gaza? We know every reason why everything won't work. So what do you want? There's only one community in Israel who will tell you what they want. And that's the ultra-right, who tell you, I know what I want. I want to resettle Gaza. Because, as you learned, when I resettle Gaza, I strengthen the national fortitude. And when I strengthen the national fortitude and our hold on the land, I'm bringing God back into the equation, and redemption is around the corner. They're putting forth a very clear utopia. They have no problems with utopia. It's really interesting. They claim that their utopia is actually the only one built on realpolitik, which is it's part of their power. What's our utopia? We have to start talking utopia again. Now, which utopia we talk makes a big difference. Maybe we don't have to talk about wolves lying with the lambs. Maybe we talk about Zechariah. Maybe Zechariah, that a day will come when old men and women will be in the squares of Jerusalem, each with a staff hand because of their great age. And the square of the city shall be crowded with boys and girls playing. And maybe, that sounds pretty utopian right now, but leave alone the transformations in nature. Let's get better at our utopias. Maimonides teaches us that utopias shouldn't be disconnected from reality, that messianism is not the transformation of the laws of nature, and that the wolf lying with the lamb is not the wolf lying with the lamb. And by the way, who's the wolf? He doesn't want to be a wolf. He says the evil idolaters, wisdom will fill the land. Okay, we have to be realistic about it. When you have so transformational and transformative utopias, no one's going to take you seriously. But what do we want? Israeli society today is not against the two-state solution. But there's no one in Israeli society, if you ask the average Israeli, what do you want? I don't know. We are the people of the status quo. But we have to become people of dreams. The people of the status quo is not going to fill the moral void. We have to start asking ourselves, Zionism has to ask itself, what is it that you want? I am declaring I want to live side by side with Israel and Palestinians in peace and security, in which each country has an ability and a right to flourish. I want it. What about you want to do it with people who want to kill you? I didn't say that. I'm telling you what I want. You're willing? Nope. I want to tell you what I want. Let's talk about what we want. Let's bring that back into our souls. Let's bring that back into our political discourse. What do we want? The job of utopia is not to be that which is implementable. The job of utopia is to determine who you want to be. And only if you have an idea about who you want to be, do you have a direction in your life. Otherwise, where are you? Israel can't even talk. And when the government has a plan for Gaza, they can't even tell Israelis. We can't even share it with you. We can't even share that we're giving humanitarian aid. We then speak to people in the newspaper in English, hoping that they won't watch it in Hebrew. We don't talk. What do you want? It used to be Israeli parties had a platform. They don't even have platforms anymore. That was Netanyahu's strength. He said, I'm the platform. I'm your Abba. I'll take care of you. I'll fix it. And Israeli society said, yes, we trust you. Not anymore. But Gantz and Lapid, Bennett, when Bennett speaks about his utopia, he says, I have a dream of an Israel where the ministers actually go to work. Maybe that's a version of Zechariah. I happen to love Bennett. You know what it's like getting up in the morning, because you don't know this, maybe you do. You know what it's like when you have a minister of transport who paves streets and sidewalks on the basis of how that neighborhood voted for her in the Likud primaries. Yeah. So Bennett says, maybe that's Zechariah, maybe that's enough, but I want to know what else. If Zionism is going to win, now we have anti-Semites who the rabbis speak about criticism and say, just as it is a mitzvah to say that which will be heard, so it is a mitzvah not to say that which will not be heard. There's nothing to say to the absolute blatant anti-Semites. There's nothing to say to those who want Israel wiped off the map and for whom 7.8 million Jewish lives just simply don't matter. The only thing you do with them is you defend yourself. The only thing you do is you use whatever legal, political means you have to limit not their freedom of speech, to limit their duplicity in the notion of what speech is allowed and what hate speech is not allowed, and to fight for our right to be in spaces where certain hate speech is not allowed. Because if it's not allowed for others, it shouldn't be allowed for us too. You do everything in your power to fight and to defend yourself against those anti-Semites. But that doesn't mean you should stop dreaming. Doesn't mean that there aren't people you need to talk to. And for Zionism to win, not everybody is our enemy. For Zionism to win here in Israel and for Zionism to win around the world, we have to talk about what we want. And it's not going to be self-congratulatory statements about we're the most moral people in the world and let me show you some more pictures. It's not going to be enough. It's about, just like Maimonides, it's about taking your utopia and your dream and seeing what could you implement now. What could you do? What should you stop doing? Or maybe it's just talking about your utopias. Like the Jewish people. We pray for peace all the time. Unfortunately, we already have a tradition of not listening to our prayers. It's not God who doesn't listen to our prayers. We don't listen to our prayers. It's just words. I began to see what it's like to live in a society where people aren't dreaming anymore. And the maximum that we could hope for is a return to the status quo. That's the maximum that we could hope for. But if we're going to fill this moral void, we have to be a people who dreams again. And doesn't claim, and in the Middle East, a utopia that you think is a reality. When you say peace now, you're dangerous. But when you say, I want peace, you become a critical instrument for our moral growth. And to end, there's a time for killing. But there has to be a time for healing. There has to be a time for peace, not just a time for war. And Yehuda Amichai, in his poem, A Man Doesn't Have Time in His Life, says to Kohelet, a man doesn't have time in his life to have time for everything. He doesn't have seasons enough to have, it's not in your books. He doesn't have seasons enough for every purpose. You're going to have to look and Google for it. Ecclesiastes was wrong about that. A man needs to love and to hate at the same moment, to laugh and cry with the same eyes, with the same hands to throw stones and to gather them, to make love and war and love, and to hate and forgive and remember and forget, to arrange and confuse, to eat and digest what history takes years and years to do. We don't have the time anymore. And it's the job of the lovers of Israel to stand with Israel. But it's to expand what standing with Israel means. Because we have to win this war. But we also have to fill the moral void. We have to get to an Israel tomorrow, not just in Gaza, but also in the West Bank. We have to get to an Israel tomorrow within Israeli society. The work of Zionism is not yet done. It's not yet done. I don't know how this war is going to end and what it means and what victory we're going to have. But the war over Israel tomorrow, defeat is not an option. Being mediocre is not an option. There is a time for everything. And in our destiny, we have to be a people who engage in peace and in healing, even at the same time that we're in war and we're killing. And when we do that, Zionism will win. And we do that, Israel will be the country, not that we want it to be. Israel will be the country that it itself aspired to be. Thank you. And now, thank you very much. Are there any questions? Yes, please. Yes.
As I'm sure you know, many of our young people are declaring themselves to be anti-Zionists. Very, very painful. And I have defined for myself that they are outside the tent as a group, not as individuals. Try to embrace them lovingly as individuals. And at the end, when I heard you talking, though, something flipped for me, and I'd love to hear you comment on this, because when you talk to some of those young people, some are, but some, they're talking about what they want. Right? They want an Israel that is fully pluralistic, fully egalitarian, where one group doesn't have privilege over the other. And we all know the reasons why that's not realistic on the ground. I'd love to hear how you think
I
about
wonder
that.
whether we're pushing a lot of people out of the Zionist camp because we're not imagining the Israel we want and we're not speaking with them about it. Or if we are, we're not speaking about it enough. Or if we're just speaking about it and not implementing into some of our policies. And if that's the case, where do you want them to go? Where do you want them to go? So and I know it's hard. And I have no patience to start talking about Israel's moral responsibilities on October 8th. I don't. Nor on November 15th. But by July, we're losing. I think we go them better. And I think we can. You know, millennialism, what are the other generations they are now? There's another millennialism, Gen Zs, or what. It's not a skin disease that passes with time. Maybe there are Sergio Tot. Maybe there are critics. Maybe they're telling us something that we don't want to hear about the way we've been talking about Zionism, even though we don't believe, because in this, Peter Beinart was wrong when he said, there's no criticism of Israel in the Jewish community. Right? Really, which Jewish community were you living in? And he would say no Jewish community ever allows this type of conversation while he's the keynote speaker at the event. Right? Like, where do you think you are? Right? So, but maybe at the end of the day, we didn't create a consistent message. Maybe we were yes butters. You know what a yes butter is? Who's the therapist here who knows what yes but is? Well, you know, when somebody's in therapy and you say something, you give them some feedback and they say yes, but. And the minute they do yes, but, they're in a cycle that they can't free themselves from. Because that but, if they said no, you could talk. Because how could you deny? You just did this. No, they say yes, but. Maybe we're all yes butters. We're speaking. Yes, Israel has to be this and this, but the but is so strong that it's shutting it down, and it is quieting so that people aren't hearing where it is that we stand. When Zionist education, the aspiration of a successful Zionist education is what? That the children should believe that it's complicated. Really? That's it? Occupation is complicated. No, it isn't. Occupation is wrong. The fact that I can't free myself from it, but occupation is wrong. We want everybody to know it's complicated. What is your moral standard? Where is your moral core? Where's your derech chokhmah v'chasidut? Who are you? Where is this voice that Yisrael Rachmanim em alakol? What do you want? To say over and over again what you want, and then we wonder, why aren't you following? Maybe Israel studies and Zionism is not worthy of following the way we're communicating it right now. Maybe we're not doing good enough. Maybe we don't have enough critics. Maybe we're not allowing morality into Zionist discourse in a way because we're afraid it's going to all fall apart. And I know it's dangerous, and I'm not being prophetic. I'm not saying I know what to do. I just know what questions we have to ask, and I know we're not doing good enough right now. We haven't found the right balance. You know why? Because it's our kids and our grandchildren who are standing up, who are raised in Zionist communities, who are coming to us and saying, What's going on? So there are Sergio Tot, and they're saying, Judaism, all of it is true, but the Israel part, what are you going to do about it? And the question is, what are we going to do about it? Yes, please, right here. I see you. I see 4, and that's what we're going to. I see your hand, your hand, your hand in the back, and then and Louis, and we'll end there. I apologize, because then we have to.
Hi, Andrea London from Evanston, Illinois. I'm a little bit bothered that we set up safety and security on one side and values on the other, as opposed to seeing safety and security are actually part of our moral system.
I said that explicitly.
I didn't hear you say that. Okay.
So let
glad
me
you did
stop
that.
you for a second,
Okay.
because it's really important and you should watch the video. I said defending ourselves is not just simply a right, it is a moral obligation, and that's why juxtaposing them is wrong.
Good. I'm glad, and I'm sorry that
And
I
I
missed
appreciate-
that.
no, I
I'm
appreciate-
sorry. I'm sorry that I missed that, because I think that is
The fact is, I might not have been as clear as I would have liked to be.
Okay.
But so I'm using it. Yes, please.
Because I think that when we're talking about living according to our values, we're talking about doing that which is best for ourselves, that we need to stop having the conversation about we're going to do this as a gift to the others, but this is what we need to be doing. And the conversation that needs to be happening within Israeli society is what we are doing going to bring us greater safety and security? That's the conversation that we need to be having at this moment, not whether or not, we're doing nice things for the other people, but what does it mean for us here? And I think that when we can have that conversation, that this is about our well-being and about our future, that I think that people can hear it in another kind of way.
Thank you.
So I'd like you to respond to that.
I appreciate that. You and I disagree. But it doesn't mean I'm correct. You all know that. I don't claim to be correct, but I want to tell you that I disagree with you. I'll tell you why. But I appreciate very much the question. When I do morality, I'm not doing it because for somebody else. The central issue is not, you're saying, juxtaposing morality with the central discussion in Israel has to be what's good for us. Morality is a conversation that doesn't entail what's good for you or good for others. Maybe it's about what's good for others. You remember there used to be these ads for tzedakah, you'll feel great about yourself? It's about doing the right because it is right. I care about morality because that's what is the right thing to do. Now, I have utilitarian conversations. I personally refuse to reduce all of morality to utilitarianism. I refuse. No. What? Imen what?
That is our life, that our moral system is also giving us life and giving others life, and that there's a self-preservation in that.
But you see, I'm with you. I'm with you. Self-preservation is part of my moral world, but it's not my only moral world. Now it's true, my life takes precedence. That's clear. Every community has greater loyalty to its own. I have to tell you, and I spoke about it in my podcast, when Israel freed the 4 hostages, I was not worried about the consequences. I was not. Morality creates concentric circles of loyalty, and my first and core loyalty is to my citizens and my people. Every Israeli claims me. First. And Gazans who are there with Hamas, whether that was the real number or whether they were the people trying to attack the hostages, my loyalty was clear. But there is a conversation which is utilitarian. That's one conversation. We left Gaza in 2005 under utilitarian calculation that we don't want to control them. But there's another conversation. It's not all utilitarian. And for me, that conversation of doing the right, don't treat other human beings as a means, but rather as an end, claims me. And I just want that to be part of the Israeli discourse. It's a discourse not about what's good only for us, but what is the good? Because the Jew, Rahmanim Elam Alakol, that's who I am. That's my country. That's why I'm all in. That's why I'm willing to die for this country. That's why I live here. That's why I support it. That's why I stand with it. It's because morality is not utilitarian alone. It's because my soldiers say that I'm going to do everything in my power to avoid civilian casualties, even if it means endangering ourselves some of the time, but not all the time. That's the dance. That's the story. And so I'm not juxtaposing security with ethics or selfish. It's just, I'm trying to paint, and I think maybe that's what you're saying, and if I was misunderstood, that's not what I'm talking about. That's what you, not you. Those who want to discount what I'm saying will say that. I'm not talking about that. I have a notion of what it means to be a Jew. And I don't look to the left or to the right. Of course I want to live by humanity, by international law. That's the minimum. But I want to live by my law. And I want to ask, when I go to war, and there's 2 million people there, and the level of destruction that we had to bring about, and what does it mean to defeat an army under those circumstances? Yes, I want to have compassion. I want to ask myself what I have to do. I want to ask myself in Judea and Samaria, what do I have to do to bring about a possible Palestinian state one day? With all the context that I know that makes it difficult, I want to ask it because that's what it means to be a Jew. Because to be a Jew is alechet b'derech Hashem lasot tzedakah u'mishpat. Not because it's in my self-interest, and not because I'm caring about you and not me. It's because human beings are an end. And I want to live in a world in which that is so. I think in the corner, far corner, you had a question? I'm sorry, it'll just...
Thank you, Donniel. I'll make it very brief. When Huda spoke on the beginning and now you at the end, I realized, and it must be said, there is a huge elephant in the room. And that begins with an F and ends with ism. Or in the States, it begins with a T and ends with ump. Long ago...
Could you just... I didn't pick up the nuance.
Fascism.
What?
Fascism.
Fascism.
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Long ago...
Now I got you. See, because
Okay. I don't remember whether it was Yigal Allon or somebody else predicted back in the 80s that the occupation and other situations, the continuous war, could bring us to the point where Israel would become an anti-democratic or at least non-democratic state. Bibi and his friends made a deal with themselves.
I'm going to ask you now, I'm going to ask you to shorten just a little bit for me.
I'm asking, I don't live here, maybe I will someday. You've got to find a way, those of you in the reasonable camp, to get rid of these leaders.
You think?
Or you will not.
I'm with you.
Happen.
I want to tell you. First of all, I appreciate what you're saying. And it's true. Fascism is not at the fringe of Israeli society anymore. On October 6th, we were on the verge of creating a huge 70% coalition of right, center, and left who are going to stand for liberal Judaism and Zionism. The demonstrations started one way, they ended in another place, and our country was shifting, and it was glorious. And for the first time in years, I felt that I was on the verge of victory. October 7th changed a lot of that. Changed all of it. And it didn't, not only did it create a right wing which was more audacious or more arrogant, but a lot of the center and the left gave up liberal conversation. Literally, that's why I'm teaching this. And I don't just teach this to you, I'm teaching this to Israelis all over the place. Because they're in a time of war, and I'm saying, what about a time for healing? What is a time of war doing for us? And in the time of war, the fascists of Israel are becoming stronger. But at the same time, just watch. They're on the verge of losing everything. Because at the end of the day, we're not going to settle in Gaza. And at the end of the day, we're not going to be able to keep Nitzarim Road and the bases that we built in the Nitzarim path, cutting Gaza in half. And Strzok and Ben-Gvir could say, the minute you give up that road, the coalition is over. And then okay, the coalition will be over. At the end of the day, their utopia is a dystopia for most Israelis. We left Gaza because it was a dystopia. We didn't leave Gaza because we wanted to give Gazans great rights. We left Gaza because all of us refused to allow our soldiers to die for 8,000 settlers. Now we realize that we have other challenges because there's hundreds of thousands of people in the Gaza envelope and in the north who aren't protected. But we left because that was a dystopia, and moving back and being a country that denies any role of ours in the world and which lives in a universe where the only people who matter are our Jewish chevrach, our Jewish Israelis, that's a dystopia. And it's true, it's here. And you want to know something? I'm going to aggravate you even more. I don't know if you know this. It wasn't just that Netanyahu told Smotrich to include Ben Gvir into a coalition. In the last municipal elections for the city of Tel Aviv, the Likud and Otzma Yehudit ran in a joint list. Talk about normalizing fascism. We need a change of government because we need to let new dreams populate the souls of our country. But our country is going to have to begin to think in those terms before they elect somebody new. And that's that process. But I know it's really late. Louis, we just know each other so many years. I can't not give you it, so please, I apologize, but last one, and I couldn't get to other people. Yes, please, Louis.
This will just take a sec. Thanks to you and Michal for something that you perhaps didn't intend, which is to enable me to tilt in the direction of thinking, why does the state of Israel have to embody Jewish values at all? Who says that we're B'nai Rachmanim? Maybe Jewish values today means Ravta, Rav Melamed. Maybe they've become the articulators, and if so, let's do a disconnect.
Right. The problem is that those who want to do a disconnect cause Rabbi Melamed and Rabbi Tau to win. One of the bad consequences of our success over the last 30 years, that's all of our success, is that we made Israelis very, very Jewish. Israelis aren't secular Israelis anymore. Most of them are traditional Jews, even if they still don't call themselves that name. They're Jews. If the choice is between a Jewish state and a democracy, they're going to pick a Jewish state. And they feel they have no choice but to pick so. And they feel that those ideologies are the only ideologies which are going to protect them. And if Israel stops being a place that they feel is safe, not just safe from Hamas, but safe from assimilation, safe from loss of identity, a place where I, as a proud Jew, could live at home. And when you're threatening that, they walk away from you. The only way to win is to engage in a cultural war within the heart of Judaism. And it's not just within the heart of religious Zionism. It's also within the heart of secular Judaism and traditional Judaism. And in North America, it's also in the heart of Reform and Conservative and Reconstructionist. How do you do Israeli Jewish politics? What do you do? How do you translate that? And so I wish there was an easy solution. There's no easy solution for Gaza, and there's no easy solution for the future of Zionism. But I have to tell you, we got to fight. And the last thing I want to tell you is that you do not know, or maybe you do, that all of you are a gift to this institution. We love it when you're here. We love when you come here to study. Our job is to serve you. Our job is to walk with you so that you could guide and lead the Jewish people. We have so many battles. With Israelis, I'm talking about the war in Gaza. With you, we have to talk about the war that you face. You're our greatest allies. And when you come here to study, at least for those few days, the world is good. Thank you for blessing our place with your presence.